The timeline matters. The F-15 goes down first. 2 crew members eject. They survive the initial loss and end up in open water. Within minutes, their emergency beacon is transmitting. The location is fixed quickly. That is standard. U.S. search and rescue coordination is built for speed. Once a beacon is live, the clock starts, and every decision that follows is shaped by how long those aircrew can survive where they are. Rescue is not optional. It is procedural. It is cultural. It is expected. The response begins immediately. Assets are tasked. A recovery package is assembled. And as always, protection for that package becomes a parallel priority. You do not just send a helicopter into a contested zone and hope for the best. You build a protective layer around it. That is where the A-10 comes in. Not the earlier aircraft that had already been lost in a separate engagement. A different A-10, different pilot, same mission profile. Provide close air support and threat suppression for the rescue operation. Its job is straightforward in concept. Arrive ahead of or alongside the recovery effort, scan for threats, neutralize anything that could endanger the helicopter or the personnel in the water. The aircraft is loaded accordingly, weapons configured for rapid response. The pilot is experienced in exactly this kind of mission: low altitude, high awareness, fast engagement cycles. This is the kind of work the A-10 was designed for. But the A-10 never reaches the rescue area. It is engaged before it can establish control of the battle space. The data that comes back from its final moments is consistent with what was recorded during the F-15 loss. Same engagement pattern. Same absence of warning indicators that would normally precede a surface-to-air attack. No conventional radar cue that gives the pilot time to react, maneuver, or deploy countermeasures effectively. It is the same system. That is the critical point. Not a similar system, not a different battery operating in coordination. The same operational signature, the same method, the same outcome. The A-10 is destroyed before the pilot can complete an ejection sequence. That changes the nature of the situation immediately. When a pilot ejects, the mission shifts. You now have another recovery scenario, another beacon, another life to retrieve. But in this case, there is no confirmed ejection, no secondary signal. The pilot's status moves into the category used when survival cannot be established. That is as far as it goes publicly until something changes. Now the rescue mission has produced a second loss, and the system responsible is still active. This is where the situation transitions from a single tactical incident into something more complex. Because what happens here is not just a successful engagement, it is a sequence, a repeatable pattern. The first aircraft is engaged and destroyed. The rescue response is triggered, as expected. The follow-on asset, the one sent to protect the rescue, is then engaged using the same method. That is not coincidence. That is anticipation. Whoever is operating this system understands how U.S. rescue operations unfold. They understand the timing, the routing, the asset allocation. They know that once an aircraft goes down and a beacon is active, additional aircraft will enter the same operational space within a predictable window. And they are prepared to exploit that. The system is not relocated after the first engagement. It is not shut down or repositioned to avoid detection. It remains in place. It stays active. It waits. That decision is not technical. It is strategic. Holding position after a successful engagement carries risk. In most cases, air defense systems relocate quickly to avoid counterstrikes. Mobility is survival. But here, the operators choose to remain. Why? Because the second opportunity is more valuable than the first. The first kill removes a combat aircraft. The second kill targets the rescue framework itself. It attacks the structure that supports every air operation in a contested environment. And that is exactly what happens. The A-10 flies into the same engagement zone. It does so under mission requirements that limit its ability to deviate significantly from expected approach paths. It needs to be in position to protect the rescue. That requirement shapes its route, its altitude profile, its timing. Those constraints create predictability. Predictability creates vulnerability. The system engages again, and once again it does so without presenting the kind of detectable signature that would normally allow the aircraft to respond in time. No early radar lock, no clear cue that triggers defensive action with sufficient lead time. The engagement is already in motion before the pilot fully understands what is happening. That is why the A-10 does not survive. At this point, the operational picture becomes clear. There is a threat in the area that does not behave like conventional air defense systems. It does not rely on continuous emissions that can be tracked, categorized, and targeted. It does not announce its presence in a way that standard warning systems can process early enough to be useful. And it is not a one-time asset. It is persistent. It can engage, remain in place, and engage again. That combination is what creates the problem. Because most tactical responses are built around detection. You identify the threat, you locate it, you suppress or destroy it, and then you proceed. But when identification fails, when the system does not present enough information to be tracked reliably, the entire response cycle breaks down. Now you have aircraft operating in an area where a lethal system exists, but cannot be precisely located. That forces a shift in how missions are conducted. The immediate effect on the rescue operation is delay. After the A-10 is lost, additional coordination is required. You cannot simply continue with the same plan. The threat has proven it can engage not just primary targets, but also the assets assigned to protect recovery efforts. That changes the risk calculation. More assets are brought in, more time is taken. The rescue becomes more complex. But eventually, the F-15 crew is recovered. That outcome matters. It reinforces the underlying commitment to retrieval, but it does not erase the cost. An additional aircraft is lost. A pilot's status remains unresolved, and the system responsible is still in the area. For commanders managing the situation, the implications are immediate. You now have confirmation that a single system can produce multiple losses in sequence, not through mass engagement, not through overwhelming force, but through timing and positioning. It leverages the structure of the opposing force's response. That is a different kind of threat. It does not need to dominate the airspace. It only needs to understand how that airspace will be used. And right now it does. The engagement of the A-10 on a rescue cover mission carries a different weight than the initial F-15 loss. Combat losses are expected in contested environments. Aircraft are designed, crews are trained, and missions are planned with that risk in mind. But a loss during a rescue protection mission hits a different layer of operational logic. Because the purpose of that mission is not to strike, not to gather intelligence, not to project force. It is to protect personnel who are already vulnerable. When that mission fails, when it results in an additional loss, it forces a reassessment of how and when rescue operations are conducted. And that is where the broader implications begin. The system has demonstrated that it can do more than just engage aircraft. It can shape behavior. It can influence decision-making. It can create hesitation in processes that are normally automatic. That is the real impact of the second engagement. Not just the destruction of the A-10, but the introduction of doubt into a system that depends on speed, confidence, and predictability to function effectively. The F-15 crew is back. The A-10 is gone. The system remains. And now every subsequent operation in that area has to account for what just happened, not as an isolated event, but as a model that could repeat. What happened in that sequence is not just a loss pattern, it is a structural problem. The issue is not simply that 2 aircraft were destroyed, it is that both losses occurred within a predictable operational loop, one that is built into U.S. doctrine itself. That loop begins with an aircraft loss, transitions immediately into a rescue operation, and then introduces additional assets into the same contested space under time pressure. That loop has always existed. What has changed is that it has now been successfully exploited. To understand the scale of the problem, you have to look at how rescue operations are designed. When a crew ejects, the response is not improvised. It follows a defined structure. Recovery helicopters are tasked. Escort and protection assets are assigned. Airspace is managed to support the operation. Timing is compressed because survival conditions degrade quickly once a crew is in the water. Every element of that response is optimized for speed and coordination. But speed and coordination create patterns, and patterns can be studied. In this case, the opposing side appears to have done exactly that. They did not just engage the initial aircraft. They anticipated the follow-on sequence. They understood that a rescue effort would bring additional aircraft into a known area within a known time frame. That is not guesswork. That is operational awareness. The decision to keep the air defense system in place after the first engagement reflects that awareness. It is not a defensive posture. It is an offensive one, built around expectation rather than reaction. The system is not chasing targets. It is waiting for them. This is where the technical characteristics of the system become critical. Traditional air defense systems rely on emissions that can be detected: search radar, tracking radar, guidance signals. Those emissions provide warning. They allow aircraft to identify threats, deploy countermeasures, or alter flight paths. In this case, That warning is either absent or arrives too late to be useful. That changes the engagement dynamic completely. If an aircraft cannot detect a threat before it is engaged, then its ability to respond is limited to what it can do in the final seconds of the engagement window. That is not enough in most scenarios, especially when the system appears capable of initiating engagement without prior detectable activity. For the A-10, that limitation is decisive. The aircraft is designed for survivability in environments where threats are known and can be engaged or avoided. It is heavily armored. It can absorb damage. It can operate at low altitude with a high degree of control. But those advantages depend on awareness. They depend on the pilot having enough information to react. Remove that awareness, and the platform's strengths are reduced. That is exactly what happened. Now consider how that interacts with the rescue mission itself. The A-10 is not free to maneuver unpredictably across the entire region. It has to position itself relative to the rescue area. It has to maintain coverage. It has to be where the helicopter will be, or where the crew is located, or along the likely threat vectors that could endanger the recovery. That requirement narrows its operational space. It creates corridors of movement that are functionally predictable, even if exact flight paths vary. Those corridors can be analyzed. They can be anticipated. And if a threat system is positioned within or near those corridors, it does not need to search for targets. It only needs to wait for them to enter its engagement envelope. This is the intersection of doctrine and vulnerability. Rescue doctrine is built on reliability. It assumes that when certain conditions are met, certain actions will follow. That reliability is what makes rapid recovery possible. It is also what makes the system efficient. But when an adversary understands that reliability, it becomes a point of leverage. In this case, the leverage is clear. The initial engagement triggers a response that brings additional aircraft into a defined area. The system that caused the initial loss remains in place and engages again. That is not a one-time coincidence. It is a repeatable mechanism. And that is what makes it dangerous. Because once a mechanism is identified and proven, it can be scaled or repeated. It can be applied in different locations, at different times, against different types of aircraft. The specific platform is less important than the pattern. The pattern is what matters. For commanders, this creates an immediate dilemma. If rescue operations continue to follow established procedures, then they risk creating additional engagement opportunities for the same type of system. If those procedures are altered significantly, then the speed and effectiveness of recovery may be reduced. That is not a simple trade-off. On one side, you have the risk of losing additional aircraft and potentially additional personnel during rescue operations. On the other side, you have the risk of delaying recovery for crews who are already in a vulnerable position. Both outcomes carry consequences. This is where doctrine begins to shift. Not publicly, not in a way that is immediately visible, but internally. Adjustments are made to reduce predictability. Routes are varied. Timing is less rigid. Additional suppression efforts are introduced before rescue assets move into position. The objective is to break the loop. If the adversary is relying on predictable sequences, then those sequences need to change. But changing them is not straightforward. Every modification introduces new variables, new risks, and new coordination challenges. For example, increasing standoff distances for protective aircraft can reduce exposure to the threat system, but it also reduces the immediacy of support if something goes wrong during the rescue. Delaying entry into the area allows for more preparation, but it extends the time that the downed crew remains exposed. There is no perfect solution. At the same time, the intelligence effort intensifies. Identifying the system becomes a priority that extends beyond the immediate incident. Without identification, there is no precise targeting. Without targeting, the system remains operational. And as long as it remains operational, it can repeat the same engagement pattern. This is where the situation becomes more than a tactical issue. It becomes an intelligence problem. The system's ability to operate without clear, trackable emissions complicates that effort. Traditional methods of detection, signals intelligence, radar tracking, pattern analysis, are less effective when the system minimizes its exposure. That suggests a level of design or operational discipline that is specifically intended to avoid detection. It is not just about firing and moving. It is about controlling when and how the system reveals itself, if at all. That level of control indicates planning, and planning indicates intent. The intent here appears to be clear. Create a persistent threat that can engage high-value targets while remaining difficult to locate and eliminate. Once that threat is established, use it to exploit predictable operational responses. The F-15 engagement demonstrates the system's ability to destroy a frontline aircraft. The A-10 engagement demonstrates its ability to exploit the response to that destruction. Together, they form a complete cycle. For aircrew operating in the area, this changes the psychological environment. Flying in a contested space always involves risk. That is understood. But the nature of that risk matters. When threats are known, when systems can be detected, when engagements follow recognizable patterns, pilots can adapt. They can train for those scenarios. They can rely on their systems and their experience. When a threat operates outside those expectations, the uncertainty increases. It is no longer just about skill or reaction time. It is about whether the threat can be seen at all before it acts. That uncertainty does not stop operations, but it does affect how those operations are conducted. It influences decision-making at every level, from mission planning to execution, and it reinforces the urgency of resolving the underlying problem. Because as long as the system remains unidentified and operational, every mission in that area carries an additional layer of risk, one that cannot be fully mitigated through existing procedures. The loss of the A-10 on a rescue cover mission is not just a tactical setback. It is a signal. It indicates that the current balance between doctrine, technology, and intelligence has been disrupted. And until that balance is restored, either through identification and neutralization of the system, or through changes that deny it the opportunity to engage, the same conditions that produce those two losses will continue to exist. The system does not need to be everywhere. It only needs to be in the right place, at the right time, with the right understanding of how its opponent will respond. Right now, it has all three. What this sequence ultimately challenges is not just tactics or technology. It challenges a foundational principle. Every military aviation system operates on an implicit agreement between leadership and aircrew. Missions will carry risk. That is understood. But if an aircraft is lost and the crew survives, every available effort will be made to bring them back. That expectation is not symbolic. It is operational. It shapes how pilots accept risk in the first place. Remove that expectation or weaken it, and you change the entire structure of decision-making in the cockpit. The events following the F-15 loss place that principle under direct pressure. The rescue operation succeeds in its primary objective. The crew in the water is recovered. But the cost of that recovery includes the loss of the aircraft assigned to protect the mission. That is where the tension emerges. Because the commitment to recover personnel is still intact, but now it has been shown that fulfilling that commitment can be used to create additional losses. This is not theoretical. It has already happened. The system responsible did not just engage an aircraft, it engaged a sequence. It turned a standard response into a vulnerability. That forces a reassessment at the doctrinal level. The question is not whether to continue rescue operations. That is not negotiable. The question is how to conduct them without creating predictable entry points for further engagement. That is where doctrine begins to evolve. The first adjustment is variability. If predictability created the engagement opportunity, then unpredictability becomes the countermeasure. Rescue operations that once followed structured timelines and routing profiles now require greater variation. Entry points shift, timing windows expand, coordination becomes less linear and more adaptive. This introduces complexity. More variables mean more opportunities for misalignment. Communication becomes more critical. Synchronization across multiple assets becomes harder to maintain. But that complexity is necessary to reduce exposure to a system that relies on expectation. The second adjustment is distance. Protective assets like the A-10 were traditionally positioned to provide immediate close-range support. That proximity allowed for rapid response to emerging threats. But it also placed those assets directly inside the engagement zone of the system. Increasing standoff distance reduces that exposure. However, it also reduces immediacy. If a threat emerges near the rescue helicopter, a more distant asset takes longer to respond. That delay can be decisive. So the adjustment is not simply about moving further away. It is about balancing distance with responsiveness in a way that still protects the recovery effort. The third adjustment is preparation. Before the rescue package moves into position, additional effort is directed towards suppressing potential threat areas. This is not precise targeting, because the system has not been clearly identified, but it is an attempt to disrupt any threat that might be operating within a defined region. This approach carries its own limitations. Without accurate identification, suppression becomes generalized. It increases resource use. It expands the operational footprint, and it does not guarantee that the specific system responsible will be neutralized. But it does reduce the likelihood that a single, undetected system can operate without interference. Parallel to these doctrinal changes, the intelligence effort intensifies further. At this stage, identification is no longer just a priority, it is a requirement. A system that can engage multiple aircraft in sequence, remain in place, and avoid detection cannot be allowed to operate indefinitely. Without identification, there is no precise countermeasure. Without a countermeasure, the system retains initiative. The challenge is that the system's behavior suggests deliberate design choices aimed at avoiding detection, limited emissions, controlled exposure, engagement profiles that minimize the window during which it can be tracked. This is not accidental. It reflects an understanding of how detection systems work and how to operate below their threshold. That makes the intelligence problem more complex. It requires integration across multiple sources, signals, imagery, pattern analysis, to build a coherent picture, and that process takes time. Time is the variable that commanders do not have in abundance. Because operations continue, aircraft still fly, missions still need to be executed, and every mission that enters the affected area carries the same underlying risk. This is where the broader implications begin to take shape. The system has demonstrated that it can influence not just individual missions, but the framework within which those missions are planned. It introduces hesitation where there was previously certainty. It forces additional layers of planning where speed was once the priority. That has a cumulative effect. Over time, it slows operations. It increases resource requirements. It shifts focus from execution to mitigation, and it creates a persistent pressure on decision-making at every level. For aircrew, the impact is direct. They are trained to operate in contested environments. They expect threats, but they also rely on systems and procedures that provide a degree of visibility into those threats. When that visibility is reduced, the margin for error narrows. Every approach into the operational area now carries an added question. Is the system still there? And if it is, will it engage again in the same way? There is no clear answer. That uncertainty does not stop missions, but it changes how they are approached. It reinforces discipline. It emphasizes coordination, and it increases reliance on evolving doctrine to compensate for what technology and intelligence have not yet resolved. At the strategic level, the situation introduces urgency. Not abstract urgency, but operational urgency. A system that can produce repeated losses without being identified creates a trajectory that is difficult to sustain. Each additional engagement reinforces its effectiveness. Each delay in resolving the problem increases the probability of another loss. There are two primary ways to break that trajectory. The first is identification and neutralization. If the system can be located and targeted, the loop ends. The threat is removed, and operations can return to a more stable framework. But as of now, that has not been achieved. The system remains unconfirmed in its exact configuration and position. The second is altering the operational environment itself. If the conditions that allow the system to operate are removed, whether through changes in engagement patterns, reduction in activity within the affected area, or broader de-escalation, then the opportunity for the system to engage is reduced or eliminated. That path does not solve the technical problem, but it does mitigate its effects. In the current situation, both paths are being pursued. Intelligence efforts continue to focus on identification. At the same time, operational adjustments are being implemented to reduce exposure. And beyond that, diplomatic channels are working toward reducing the overall level of conflict that creates these scenarios in the first place. Because as long as the operational environment remains active, the system retains its relevance. The sequence that began with the F-15 and continued with the A-10 has already demonstrated that the system can complete the loop once. There is no indication that it cannot do so again. That is the core issue. Not just what has happened, but what can happen next. The doctrine is adapting. The intelligence effort is intensifying. The operational approach is shifting. But until one of those tracks produces a definitive result, either through identification or through a change in the broader environment, the underlying risk remains. The commitment to recover personnel has not changed. It cannot change. But the way that commitment is executed is now under revision, shaped by a system that has shown it can turn that commitment into an engagement opportunity. The F-15 crew is recovered. The A-10 is lost. The pilot's status remains unresolved. And the system that created both outcomes is still active. That is the condition under which current operations are being conducted. And until that condition changes, every mission in that area operates with the knowledge that the loop is still open and can close again.